June 6, 1944. Somewhere inland from Omaha Beach. Just after dawn. Smoke hangs low over a hedgerow-lined field. The air smells of cordite, wet earth, and burned metal. Rifle fire cracks in uneven bursts. A group of American infantrymen is pinned down behind a shallow rise. They are wet, disoriented, and breathing hard. Someone is shouting orders, but not from where they expect. It isn't coming from the rear. It isn't coming from a radio. It's coming from right beside them. Move when I move, a voice says, low but firm. Not yelling. Not dramatic. Just certain. Staff Sergeant Paul Henson crouches a few feet away, helmet tilted forward, eyes scanning the hedgerow. He doesn't carry a map. He doesn't need one. He's been here before, not this field, not this country, but this moment. The men look to him instinctively. Not to the lieutenant somewhere behind them. Not to the chain of command printed in a manual. To Henson. You can almost feel it, that split-second decision every soldier makes under fire. Who do you listen to when everything is loud, confusing, and dangerous? The answer comes without thought. The sergeant rises first. The men follow. This moment, repeated thousands of times across Europe and the Pacific, explains something essential about the American Army in World War II. Under fire, American soldiers trusted their non-commissioned officers more than distant orders. Not because they were trained to disobey, but because survival demanded something different. In theory, the US Army followed clear lines of command. Orders flowed down. Reports flowed up. In reality, combat shredded theory within minutes. Radio lines broke. Officers became casualties. Plans dissolved the moment the first shot was fired. What remained was proximity. The man closest to you. The man who knew your name. The man who knew when to push and when not to. That man was usually an NCO. Sergeants, corporals, and staff sergeants formed the spine of American units. They were not strategists. They were not removed from danger. They lived where their men lived. They moved when their men moved. They bled when their men bled. Most had risen from the ranks. They had carried the same packs, stood the same watches, endured the same marches. That shared experience mattered. Trust isn't built by rank alone. It's built by presence. When an NCO gave an order, it wasn't abstract. It was immediate, contextual. He could see the machine gun nest. He could hear the incoming rounds. He could judge the fear in his men's faces. And his men knew that. American training reinforced this dynamic, often unintentionally. Junior officers were taught to plan. NCOs were taught to execute. But in combat, execution became decision-making. Squads broke apart. Platoons scattered. Lieutenants were often forced to manage chaos beyond their control. In those moments, the sergeant didn't wait. He acted, not because he outranked danger, but because delay killed. This wasn't insubordination. It was adaptation. The US Army valued initiative at lower levels more than many of its adversaries. Doctrine emphasized flexibility, but reality demanded it. In foxholes, in fields, in ruined villages, soldiers learned quickly whose judgment kept them alive. Not the man quoting orders. The man reading the moment. Back in that Norman field, Henson signals again. A short motion with his hand. The squad shifts left, just enough to break the angle of fire. A pause. Then another move. It isn't elegant. It isn't scripted. But it works. Later, when the firing dies down, someone will ask what the plan was. Henson will shrug. There wasn't one, he'll say. Just didn't feel right to stay put. That instinct, shaped by experience, closeness, and earned authority, became the quiet engine of American combat effectiveness. And as the war ground on, this trust would be tested again and again, sometimes with remarkable results, and sometimes with devastating consequences. Because relying on initiative at the lowest level came with a cost. And the Army would learn that lesson the hard way. The plan was never meant to survive first contact. Somewhere in France, weeks after the landings, a rifle platoon moves along a narrow road bordered by stone walls. The morning is quiet. Too quiet. Lieutenant James Carter walks near the center, map folded in his hand, trying to match landmarks to lines drawn days earlier. The route looked simple on paper. It never is. The first burst of fire comes from the left. Sharp. Close. The kind that snaps thinking into fragments. The platoon scatters instinctively, men diving for ditches, walls, doorways. Someone yells a warning. Someone else shouts an order. But it's not Carter's voice that cuts through the noise. Second squad down that wall. Now. Staff Sergeant Bill Ramirez doesn't look back to see if anyone is listening. He already knows they are. Ramirez isn't guessing. He's reading the ground. He's seen this before. Ambush fire meant to freeze movement, not destroy it. He knows the enemy will expect hesitation. So he denies them that. The squad moves as one, pressed tight against stone, rifles angled forward. Carter watches it happen, momentarily disconnected. This isn't what the plan says. But the plan is already irrelevant. American officers were trained to lead, but World War II forced a rapid and often brutal education. In combat, control dissolved faster than anyone expected. Officers had responsibilities that pulled them away from the fight itself. They coordinated with adjacent units. They managed artillery support. They worried about flanks, supply lines, objectives beyond the next field. NCOs lived inside the fight. They saw which man was shaking, which weapon had jammed, which path offered cover. That proximity changed everything. In theory, officers commanded. In practice, NCOs translated intent into action. That translation required trust, and it had to be earned. American NCOs were not distant authority figures. They were present. Visible. They corrected mistakes in training. They enforced discipline on long marches. They took responsibility when things went wrong. By the time units reached combat, most soldiers had already learned who they trusted. Not the man who quoted doctrine. The man who knew how to get them through the day. This dynamic became especially clear when communications failed. Radios broke. Runners were delayed or killed. Orders arrived late, incomplete, or impossible to execute. In those moments, waiting was more dangerous than acting. Sergeants made calls that technically exceeded their authority. They repositioned squads. They altered formations. They chose when to pull back or press forward. They did so without asking permission. And more often than not, they were right. This wasn't rebellion. It was necessity. American military culture, unlike some others, tolerated this flexibility. Mistakes were investigated, but initiative wasn't punished by default. If an NCO could explain his decision, and if his men were alive, the system often accepted it. That understanding filtered down quickly. Soldiers learned that the voice closest to them mattered most. Orders from above were important, but they were filtered through reality. Through terrain. Through exhaustion. Through fear. NCOs were the filter. Back on the road, the ambush collapses almost as quickly as it began. Enemy fire fades. The platoon regroups in pieces. Lieutenant Carter moves forward, breathless, eyes scanning for losses. Ramirez steps toward him, already reporting. 2 wounded. Nothing serious. They pulled back. Carter nods. There's no reprimand. No lecture. Just relief. Later, Carter will adjust his expectations. He'll still issue orders. He'll still carry the weight of command. But he'll learn something crucial. If things go wrong, and the sergeants will decide what happens next. This reliance wasn't accidental. It was built into the structure of American units. Squads were designed to operate semi-independently. NCOs were trained to assume command if officers fell. In the chaos of war, that design proved invaluable. But it also created tension. Because trusting NCOs over formal orders raised an uncomfortable question. What happens when initiative and command no longer align? And what happens when the wrong decision is made, at the worst possible moment? The first time a soldier decides to follow a sergeant instead of an order, it rarely feels like a decision at all. It feels like instinct. Somewhere in Italy, winter of 1943. Cold rain turns dirt paths into slick channels of mud. A rifle squad waits at the base of a rocky slope, visibility reduced to yards. An order has come down to advance. No one argues with it. No one questions where it came from, but no one moves. Staff Sergeant Anthony DeLuca studies the slope in silence. He watches water run down the rocks, listens to the wind funnel through the trees. He has fought long enough to know what this looks like. An advance here would expose his men. They would climb slow. They would have nowhere to go. DeLuca doesn't tear up the order. He doesn't announce defiance. He delays. He sends one man forward instead of 10. Then another. He waits. When fire breaks out above them, it confirms what he already suspected. Had they moved as ordered, the squad would have been caught in the open. No one thanks him. There is no recognition, but his men notice. Authority in combat doesn't come from insignia. It comes from judgment. American NCOs understood this deeply. They enforced discipline not through distance, but through credibility. When they demanded something, soldiers believed there was a reason. That belief came from shared hardship. NCOs slept where their men slept, ate the same rations, stood watch in the same weather. When punishment was required, it came from someone who understood the cost. This closeness mattered under fire. In moments of chaos, soldiers didn't have time to evaluate rank structures. They responded to voices they recognized. That recognition created a powerful bond. Trust replaced rigid command. This wasn't unique to one theater. In the Pacific, where terrain swallowed formations whole, NCO authority became even more critical. Jungles broke units into fragments within minutes. Visibility collapsed. Sound carried unpredictably. A sergeant who knew how his men moved became the center of gravity. Officers often found themselves coordinating at a distance, managing supply drops, calling for support. NCOs made the fight happen. The US Army recognized this, sometimes formally, often informally. Field manuals emphasized the role of NCOs as leaders, not just enforcers. Training pushed responsibility downward. But combat accelerated the lesson. Casualties among junior officers were high. Lieutenants were visible targets. They moved to coordinate, to observe. When they fell, the NCO stepped in without hesitation. There was no ceremony, no pause. The men expected it. This expectation shaped behavior. NCOs trained, with the understanding that they might command at any moment. They paid attention to the broader situation. They listened closely during briefings, not because they sought authority, but because responsibility would find them anyway. Back on the Italian slope, DeLuca finally signals movement. Not upward, sideways. The squad shifts along a narrow ridge out of sight. They advance slowly, methodically. By the time the enemy realizes what's happening, the angle has changed. The fight is brief, contained. Afterward, the order to advance is never mentioned again. No report is filed. No correction issued. The system absorbs the deviation and moves on. This flexibility saved lives. But it also created a quiet dependency. American units began to rely heavily on the judgment of their NCOs, sometimes more than the structure above them. And that reliance raised a difficult truth. When leadership becomes personal rather than institutional, its success depends entirely on the people holding it. Most NCOs rose to the challenge. Some did not. And when they failed, the consequences were immediate and unforgiving. The decisions that mattered most in combat were rarely written down. They were made in seconds. Sometimes in silence, often under pressure that crushed hesitation. Somewhere in the Ardennes, December 1944. Snow blankets the ground. Visibility is poor. The cold is constant. A rifle company is spread thin along a forest edge. Orders from battalion are clear, hold the line. But the line isn't clear at all. Squads are separated by hundreds of yards. Tree trunks block sightlines. Sound travels strangely in the cold. Staff Sergeant Harold Owens commands a forward squad positioned slightly ahead of the rest. He senses something is wrong. The forest is too quiet. Owens has no confirmation. No intelligence update. Just experience. He pulls his men back 10 yards, not enough to break contact, but enough to change the angle. It is a minor adjustment. Minutes later, enemy fire cuts through the position they just left. Had they stayed, casualties would have been immediate. No one above Owens will ever know why the squad survived. There will be no report praising initiative. But his men understand. This is the kind of trust that grows invisibly. Not built on heroics. Built on consistency. Across the US Army, similar decisions shaped outcomes. NCOs decided when to hold fire. When to move. When to pull wounded men back instead of pressing forward. Each choice carried risk. And, because these choices were made so low in the structure, they carried immense weight. Officers relied on this system, sometimes without fully realizing it. Platoon leaders learned quickly that control was an illusion. Influence was what mattered. They issued intent, not instructions. Take that ground. Hold until relieved. How you do it is up to you. This wasn't always comfortable. Some officers struggled with the loss of direct control. Others embraced it. The most effective units were often those where officers and NCOs understood their roles clearly. Officers planned. NCOs adapted. But this balance was fragile. Under extreme pressure, trust could fray. A poorly chosen decision by an NCO could expose a flank, trigger confusion, break cohesion, and when that happened, accountability was immediate, not through courts-martial, through loss of confidence. Soldiers stopped listening. That was the ultimate failure. Because in combat, a sergeant without trust was just another man shouting into noise. The army did not always have a solution for this. Replacements arrived with rank, but no shared history. New NCOs were promoted quickly to fill gaps. Some adapted. Some did not. Veteran soldiers could tell the difference instantly. They watched closely. They measured tone, judgment, calm under pressure. Trust was granted carefully and withdrawn just as fast. Back in the Ardennes, Owens' squad holds through the night. Cold seeps into everything. At dawn, orders arrive to pull back. The withdrawal is clean, controlled. Another small success. But the broader picture is darker. The offensive rages on. Pressure increases everywhere. The weight of these small decisions accumulates. Each one buys time, or costs it. And as the war grinds forward, the army begins to understand something uncomfortable. Its effectiveness depends not on perfect plans, but on thousands of unscripted decisions made by men whose names will never appear in reports. That realization brings both confidence and risk. Because if the war is being held together by trust at the lowest level, what happens when that trust is stretched beyond its limits? By 1945, the pattern was unmistakable. American units that functioned best were not the ones with the most detailed orders. They were the ones where trust flowed freely at the lowest level. Not blind trust. Earned trust. Commanders began to notice it in after-action reports, even if it wasn't named directly. Phrases appeared again and again. Sergeant took initiative. Squad leader adjusted position. Non-commissioned officer assumed control. These weren't exceptions anymore. They were the rule. In the ruins of a German town near the Rhine, a platoon advances street by street. Buildings are shattered. Visibility changes with every doorway. Lieutenant Robert Hale remains at the rear of the formation, coordinating with neighboring units. He cannot see what his squads see. He doesn't try to. He issues a simple instruction: move forward when able. The rest is left to the sergeants. Staff Sergeant Leonard Brooks moves with his squad along the right side of the street. He watches windows, doorways, rooftops. He pauses at an intersection longer than expected. The men behind him wait without question. Brooks senses movement above them. A shadow. A sound that doesn't belong. He signals halt. Seconds later, fire erupts from an upper floor, missing them by feet. Had they advanced on schedule, the result would have been different. This is trust functioning as a weapon, not in a dramatic sense, but as a quiet advantage. The US Army did not outfight its enemies by rigid adherence to orders. It adapted faster. That adaptability lived in the NCO Corps. Sergeants acted as shock absorbers between chaos and command. They absorbed uncertainty and converted it into action. This required more than bravery. It required judgment. And judgment required autonomy. Unlike some armies that centralized decision-making, the American system tolerated and eventually relied on decentralization. Orders described intent. NCOs handled execution. This allowed units to function even when cut off, surrounded, or partially destroyed. In the Pacific, where terrain swallowed formations whole, this trust was often the only thing holding units together. A squad might operate independently for hours or days, without contact, without resupply. In those conditions, rank mattered less than competence. Men followed the one who knew what to do next. The Army recognized this and adapted its training accordingly. Late war replacements were taught not just to obey, but to observe, to think. NCO schools emphasized decision-making under stress. Not perfection, but survivability. Mistakes were expected. Paralysis was not. This philosophy wasn't written in bold letters. It emerged from experience. From Normandy. From Italy. From the Ardennes. From countless unnamed fields and forests. But trust came at a cost. Because decentralization meant variability. A strong NCO could elevate a weak unit. A weak one could undo a strong plan. The Army accepted this trade-off, because the alternative was worse. Rigid command in fluid combat led to hesitation. And hesitation killed. By the final months of the war, American soldiers knew something instinctively. If an order didn't make sense in the moment, the sergeant would fix it. That belief saved lives. But it also placed an enormous burden on NCOs. They carried responsibility without recognition, authority without distance. When things went wrong, they were closest to the consequences. As the war drew to a close, the question was no longer whether American soldiers trusted their NCOs. They did. The question was whether the Army could sustain a system built so heavily on human judgment, and whether that trust would survive the transition from war back to peace. The fighting ended unevenly. Some units received the news in formation. Others heard it through rumor, then confirmation. In Germany, spring of 1945, an infantry company halts along a quiet road. Weapons are lowered. Helmets loosened. There is no celebration, just silence. For the men who survived, the habits of war do not fade quickly. They still look to their sergeants. Not for orders now, but for reassurance. Staff Sergeant Leonard Brooks stands with his squad, hands on his hips, staring down the road. The same men who followed him through ruined towns and sudden ambushes wait for a signal that never comes. There is nothing left to do. The war is over. In the weeks that follow, the US Army begins the long process of transition. Units reorganize. Equipment is turned in. Men prepare to go home. But the lessons of combat linger. Officers reflect on what worked and what didn't. Again and again, one conclusion surfaces quietly. The war was held together at the squad level by men whose names rarely appeared in headlines. Non-commissioned officers had carried the weight of combat leadership in ways no manual could fully capture. They had filled gaps, bridged confusion, turned intent into action. In after-action reports and informal discussions, this truth became impossible to ignore. Trust had replaced rigid command, not because doctrine demanded it, but because reality did. The Army would not forget this. In the years after World War II, training and doctrine evolved. NCO development became a priority. Leadership was no longer defined solely by rank or position, but by competence and judgment. The modern American military would be shaped by this experience. But for the men who lived it, the lesson was simpler. When everything broke down, when plans failed, radios died, and fear closed in, they listened to the voice closest to them, the one that understood the ground beneath their feet, the one that had earned their trust long before the shooting started. That trust was never written into an order. It didn't need to be. It was built day by day, under fire, in moments too small to record, and too important to forget.